Okay, good evening, everyone, and thank you for participating in tonight's public meeting for the Calvert County Hazard Mitigation Plan update. My name is Adam Leister. I am a senior consultant with MCM Consulting Group, and we are the consultant that the county selected to assist with the Hazard Mitigation Plan update. I'd like to do some brief introductions up here, so we'll start with Mike. So Mike, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
I'm Michael Rarick. I'm the project manager for the Hazard Mitigation Program from MCM Consulting Group.
Kara Buckmaster, Acting Emergency Management Division Chief for Calvert County.
Amalia Pleektam, Environmental Planner for Planning and Zoning, Calvert County.
Okay, thank you. We'll get started with the slide deck presentation right now. So as we mentioned, this is a presentation for the Calvert County Hazard Mitigation Plan update for 2023. And this is a risk assessment section presentation. So we'll go over parts of the risk assessment section, and we'll take any questions that anyone might have at the end of the presentation. So if we look at the first slide. One second. There we go. For the agenda, the first item we're going to cover is what is hazard mitigation planning. We're going to review the update process. We're going to take a look at the risk assessment section. And then finally, we're going to look at some next steps and the conclusion. So those will be our agenda points for today's presentation. And if we go to the first slide, it is why is hazard mitigation plan necessary? And a hazard mitigation plan is necessary due to the Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000, or DMA 2000, which amended the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act, or the Stafford Act. And it requires all local jurisdictions to have a hazard mitigation plan in place to receive certain types of disaster assistance and hazard mitigation funding. This includes pre- and post-disaster funding, and it requires all local jurisdictions, so not just a county or a county subdivision, but also any incorporated municipalities or smaller areas of a county or a region to have a hazard mitigation plan as well. So everyone is required to have a hazard mitigation plan in order to receive that specific funding resource. The current hazard mitigation plan was adopted and promulgated by the Calvert County Commissioners, and municipality adoption of the Calvert County Plan occurred as well. And it is used as support for pre- and or post-disaster funding since the promulgation of the plan. So the incorporated municipalities of the county, as well as the county itself, have adopted the current Calvert County Hazard Mitigation Plan, which had a date of 2017. So this is the update to that plan in 2023. The 2023 Hazard Mitigation Plan update is required to be updated every 5 years, so we are currently on that cycle as well. And the update process is continuous. Just because a hazard mitigation plan is finished in whatever calendar year the update process ends does not mean that it's a static document. All plans are reviewed annually, and county reviews all mitigation actions. Municipalities can provide progress reports on project opportunities, and it also captures any major emergencies or disaster information that might have occurred in that calendar year. And annual progress reports can be submitted to MDEM, and that's the Maryland Department of Emergency Management. The Calvert County Hazard Mitigation Grant is covering the Calvert County 2023 Hazard Mitigation Plan update. Like we mentioned at the start of the presentation, they hired us, MCM Consulting Group Incorporated, and the kickoff meeting was held on February 16th, 2023. We had a virtual meeting to go over some of the steering committee kickoff items, and then the steering committee developed a local planning team. So the local planning team is the agency that guides the hazard mitigation plan through its planning process. So that local planning team was developed after the steering committee kickoff, and that kickoff meeting for the local planning team was held on March 16th, 2023. And the update process that is currently going on for the hazard mitigation plan includes a capability assessment, a risk assessment, which we're going to discuss in greater detail tonight, and a mitigation strategy development, and a draft plan is the final product that is then sent to the state and FEMA for their review. So municipality involvement for those incorporated municipalities in the county includes complete surveys and assessments. So we ask for each local jurisdiction to submit their local information to us, since this is not only the county's plan, it is also the Incorporated Municipalities Plan. And those forms consist of a capability assessment survey, and that capability assessment survey allows us to see what kind of capabilities and actions each local jurisdiction is capable of undertaking to support hazard mitigation. And a hazard identification and risk evaluation worksheet is where we ask those local jurisdictions to take a look at all the hazards that might impact them during a calendar year and tell us which ones have increased, decreased, or stayed the same since the previous planning period. We also offer mitigation opportunity forms for each local jurisdiction to complete. And what the mitigation opportunity form is a chance for each local jurisdiction to tell us what projects they have going on within their boundaries and within their authority that could be covered by pre- and post-disaster funding if that funding is released. Municipalities that are involved also provide input into the draft plan and participate in meetings, and they'll adopt the county plan as their municipal plan so that they're covered under hazard mitigation and the Stafford Act. Public involvement is really simple. The public is there to identify any hazard areas near municipality. We also ask that you participate in any surveys and assessments and provide input into the draft plan. So after the plan is in draft status, there will be another public meeting where we will go over the draft plan, what the process was to get the plan to that status, and we'll ask for any public input that anyone in the public might have. And if they participate in meetings and assist us, that makes the plan more their plan as well for the public. And Hazard Mitigation Plan website will be the county website, which is on the screen. We will update that with the Hazard Mitigation Plan once it is in draft status. So the next part is the main portion of today's presentation, and it is a risk assessment review. So the risk assessment section is where a local planning team and the county in each jurisdiction will take a look at any hazards that might impact them during this planning period or has impacted them during the previous planning period. So this covers any hazards that might be in that jurisdiction, hazards that might be specific to a local jurisdiction, and this is really based on that local knowledge and the information that the county and the local planning team can provide. So the first item here is identifying hazards, and this is directly out of the requirements from FEMA. So the first one is, does the plan include a description of the type, location, and extent of all natural hazards that can affect the jurisdiction? Does the plan also include information on previous occurrences of hazard events and or the probability of future hazard events? And that information was directly from FEMA's updated guidance this year. So that is the most up-to-date information. So when we start identifying hazards, we like to take a look at noting and documenting past presidential, gubernatorial, county, and municipal disaster declarations. Just off the top for the county here, tropical storms was Tropical Storm Isaias, and we also included COVID-19 on that list as well. This is not a comprehensive list. This is just what we noticed were big items since the previous hazard mitigation plan update. From identifying those hazards, we also work to develop a list of natural and human-caused hazards that will affect the county and each local jurisdiction. And we review the previous hazards that are in the current plan. This one would be from the 2017 plan. And just off the top, those included coastal erosion, drought, earthquake, extreme temperature, flooding, hurricane and tropical storm, hail, landslides and sinkholes, tornado, wildfire, and winter storms. And we are including all of those in some form in the current hazard mitigation plan. We might be tweaking a few of those to better suit what the county and the local jurisdictions identified during this hazard mitigation planning process is more applicable at that time. And we also identify new hazards. So some of the new hazards that we've identified include some human-caused hazards that weren't in the previous plan, and these include emergency services, opioid epidemic, and utility interruptions. This is really to identify those areas that the county sees as the most hazardous and the ones that impact the county on a greater scale, and the local jurisdictions also have the opportunity to provide that information as well. This is compiled using hazard identification and risk evaluation worksheets and taking those results and seeing what we should include or not include in the current hazard mitigation plan. So as I just mentioned, this is a use of a hazard identification and risk evaluation worksheet, and municipality worksheets were completed by municipalities. and the county worksheet was completed by the local planning team, and all of them were compiled together. Profiling hazards is the next part of the risk assessment section, and this is another guidance pulled directly from FEMA. And this is, the plan must include a description of all natural hazards that can affect the jurisdictions in the planning area and their assets, such as dams located outside the planning area. This requirement may be met with other narrative description. And the plan must provide rationale if we are admitting or omitting any natural hazards that the community recognized to affect the participants in the planning area. So if any natural hazards were left out that would be commonly recognized as a hazard, a narrative must be put in place into the risk assessment section stating that. But we are carrying over all the natural hazards from the previous plan into this plan to make it a more comprehensive risk assessment section. So for profiling hazards, the first item we do is identify the location and the geographic extent of where that hazard is occurring or can occur. And that's done using mapping for GIS purposes. And it also relies on local knowledge. So the most up-to-date and correct information that we can get as a consultant working on a hazard mitigation plan is from the local planning team, which is the county, and from the local jurisdictions and the public of the county. So the local knowledge for everyone involved is probably one of the most important aspects when identifying the location and the geographic extent. We also define the range of magnitude, and this uses scales or measuring tools. So for some of the natural hazards, there are scales that are recognized as being in place to measure the range of magnitude and the intensity, and that defines the intensity and the impact of those hazard events. Another item that can be very beneficial to looking at risk assessment and profiling hazards is past occurrences, and this includes dates and impacts. So for example, if we were looking at flash flooding, we would determine when flash flooding occurred, where it occurred, and what the impact was to both loss of life and or property value to get an understanding of what that hazard has for past occurrences. That'll provide us with a basis for how we can analyze what's going to occur in the future. That leads us to establishing the probability of future occurrences. And like I previously mentioned, this is based off past occurrence frequency. And one item that we look at typically for establishing future occurrences is by using the special flood hazard area for each local jurisdiction in the county. And in previous hazard mitigation discussions prior to this update, it could have been called more commonly the 100-year floodplain or the 100-year flood data. And that's where we can look and see what kind of areas we could look at for future occurrences of, for example, a flooding event or a flash flooding event. And we also determine environmental impacts, such as flooding causes polluted streams, tornadoes causing scattering of debris over large areas, or droughts killing crops and trees. So the environmental impacts are very important to the hazard mitigation planning process. And one of the environmental impacts that we look at is how climate change could impact each one of these hazards and what kind of environmental impacts that might have on the jurisdiction and the county as a whole. Assessing vulnerability is another important aspect of the risk assessment section, and we do that by looking at vulnerable assets that are in a jurisdiction in the county. So that could be existing buildings, that can be community lifeline facilities, that could be new development, or it could be hazardous material facilities or utility systems. So community lifeline facilities are defined by FEMA as any facility that assists in the daily operation for health and safety of a jurisdiction. So that could include hospitals, police stations, fire stations, schools, daycares, nursing homes, clinics, things that deal with utility systems, which are also covered on that item as well. And all these information sources are put into GIS to assist with the assessment of the vulnerability. And by working with the county GIS department, we can get that done in the most efficient way possible. And that GIS data is then put into the vulnerability assessment for each hazard and shows us what aspects of the hazard we need to look at for each hazard. To continue assessing vulnerability, we also, during the process, take a look at high-risk groups or vulnerable populations. These could be the elderly, which is individuals and citizens over the age of 65 years and older, or children who are under the age of 5, or those with special needs or mobility issues, that might place them in a higher risk group or might be considered as a vulnerable population. And when we look at specifically flooding hazards, we utilize flood insurance rate maps that are published by FEMA and updated at certain times. And we also develop maps with the critical facilities, the community lifelines, and impacted structures that are used as one of the appendices to the Hazard Mitigation Plan. And that is the Municipal Flood Map series that shows all those items on a map. The final step in assessing vulnerability is estimating loss. So this is determining a potential dollar loss estimate for hazards. For flooding, we use a tool called Hazard multi-hazard software that's from FEMA. It's one of their published tools that they use. And that takes a look at building losses for a 100-year flooding event, which would be the brick and mortar part of the building, the functionality of that building during a hazard event and potentially after a hazard event. And it also looks at business interruption losses, which is if a commercial business is interrupted by a 100-year flood event or any other regulatory flood that we might want to run through the process. What kind of economic impact is that business going to occur in interruption to their normal operations? And that has its tools directly from FEMA, and it runs off of GIS data that we would get from the county and also input from FEMA sources such as flood depth grids. And if we continue on the assessing vulnerability options here, it is developing risk factors for hazards. So the local planning team in each jurisdiction should provide a risk factor assessment, and this relies on historical data, the local information that a local planning team can provide, and the 2023 Calvert County risk factor results are on the following slides. So if you'll bear with me, we will take a look at the tool that was used to do the risk factor assessment, and then we'll take a look at the results for the risk factor assessment for the county. So this risk factor assessment tool operates on 5 different categories, which includes things like occurrence, impact, spatial extent, warning time, and duration. And each one of those items is defined by different levels. So for probability at the top, you can see the defined levels there. And each level relates to a criteria. And each criteria relates to a score on a scale of 1 to 4, with 1 being the lowest and 4 being the highest. And each one of these criteria has a weighted value which goes into the final score when all the numbers are put together for a specific hazard. And each one of these 5 areas has that scoring to it. So the local planning team sat down with this tool, took a look at each one of these 5 categories for each of the hazards identified for the 2023 Hazard Mitigation Plan, and determined what were considered the highest risk hazards, what are moderate risk hazards, and what are low risk hazards for the entire county of Calvert. And that is what is on the next slide. So as you can see here, emergency services was deemed one of the highest risk hazards for Calvert County, including pandemic, epidemic, and infectious disease, opioid epidemic, extreme temperatures, winter storm, landslide, coastal erosion, hurricane and tropical storm, radon exposure, drought, invasive species, land subsidence, environmental hazards, which is hazmat for transportation, and cyber terrorism, utility interruption, flooding or 100-year flood, and then regular terrorism and transportation accidents. Those were all the high-risk hazards that the local planning team identified for the county as a whole. And the moderate risk hazards are tornado and windstorm, environmental hazards, fixed facilities, so these would be the hazardous material sites that process or store chemicals, flash flooding, hail, and then nuclear incidents, yep, thank you. And nuisance flooding is considered a low risk hazard, including earthquake, wildfire, civil disturbance, and dam failure. So those are all the hazards that were identified during the risk assessment and the risk factor assessment for Calvert County as a whole. And anything that is labeled in red is a high risk hazard, anything in yellow is a moderate risk hazard, and anything in green is a low risk hazard. So this was done by the LPT as a whole. Each local jurisdiction in the county is also asked to complete one, and that gives us more of a local knowledge as to what the risk factor is for each smaller jurisdiction. So we're on to next steps in the planning process. So the next steps for this hazard mitigation plan as it currently sits is a mitigation strategy section completion by the 5th of July, a draft of the hazard mitigation plan by the 5th of July, and public comment period will run from July 19th through August 17th of this year, with a draft submission by 8/21 and a draft submission to FEMA by 9/21 and county and municipal adoption by November. And you'll have a approved plan pending adoption at that point. So we've reached the end of the presentation. Are there any questions?
There are no speakers on Zoom.
Okay, that is great. If there are no questions, we will adjourn the meeting. And I appreciate everyone taking time out of your day to participate in this presentation and part of the hazard mitigation plan. Thank you.